So next we have a fireside chat with myself and Geoff. So Geoff was the designer for the film Her, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that. That film inspired, I'm sure, everyone in this room, showing a operating system, the next operating system, and how people could build a relationship with their operating systems. But first, I'd love, Geoff, just to give a little bit of background on your experience on that movie and also before and after.
Yeah. So I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an artist and a designer. And so I was asked to create like what Samantha and Her looks like by Spike Jonze, the filmmaker. Not as like anyone who has any experience in technology or interface design, but as an artist and a designer and someone who I'd worked with Spike on Where the Wild Things Are, and I'd done title design. So, you know, I was interested in sort of being a part of this conversation, and I've done work since Her. But really, my involvement is as an artist, as it was on the film. And so, you know, Spike brought me in to visualize something, but it was really about advancing the story from the perspective of, you know, he's an artist, like that the story came first. And so I think that the sort of interesting like situations that came out of Her are based on like the art came first, the sort of the writing and the storytelling, and the sort of emotional aspects of the film, obviously. And then out of that came like, we had to sort of like solve design problems and problems that, you know, a lot of people in this room or who have spoken are approaching from a technology perspective. And I think in general, that's sort of an interesting thing to do, you know, like have like, I think art can participate in advancing like this type of discussion in a way that's really powerful.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about in the design, how did you think about the next OS? Because OSs, we're still not stuck maybe, but since the movie, now almost 5 years later, I think, we're still with iOS, we're still with Android, but you got to try and think to think new thoughts. So how did you think about a new OS?
Yeah. I mean, I think the most important thing about Her to understand is that there was only one brief, and that was the future is nice. So I would create, you know, I was confronted with what was like an infinitely difficult problem. Like what does, you know, it's based in the near future. So what does the near future OS look like? So like I felt like, oh, I should know what I'm doing. I should know about like interface design and like a lot of sort of cognitive technological stuff. But instead I approached it with just returning to the future is nice. That it's gonna be, so it was sort of like an interesting design problem because it was like, I was comfortable in creating something that was familiar, but that it also felt like a better future. So it was like an interface that used less of our time. It was, and you know, and there was a huge, you know, aspect, which is it sounds like Scarlett Johansson, which is really nice, you know? So it's like when you get a glimpse of a visual, it's like, what is actually nice? What is like heartwarming? And I was never cynical and I was never dystopic. So my idea, like in my art, and when I do work that revolves around ideas of artificial intelligence or interacting, or like the future, is about projecting a positive future and like imagining it. Like, so as a designer, you can visualize things that are hard to talk about, hard to put into words, but you can create visuals out of them. So like with Her, it was like, okay, I am going to, like, there was no joking with the interfaces, I think was important. There was no like, oh, this is a gag. Like, I'm making a joke about our current interface then. It was like, no, what would be nice to work with? Like, what was dimensional, colorful? A lot of stuff like colors that were sort of predate our current like Mac OS that at the time it wasn't as colorful as it is now. Yeah, and then sort of moving, you know, the big thing at the moment when we did it was, when I was thinking about it, like the reference points were like the three-dimensional Minority Report was everybody referenced like this thing with like zooming stuff and it was very basically dystopic. So it was like I was always like moving like away from dystopic.
I mean, what I love about that is I also grew up with Minority Report and seeing that as the next operating system, and then seeing her, it was like, oh, something that's more gentle and kind and romantic in a kind of nostalgic sense could be the next operating system. And I think you'd mentioned that you'd then heard from technology companies that were interested in what you'd been thinking as they start to think about the next step. Are you able to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I did a long project with a company, and it was, I found myself like it was like about, I did a lot of like imagining what a future interface, a future sort of object would look like in a digital space. And I think that it's sort of interesting talking to you how that a lot of people in technology are moving away from the VR world and going back to screens, which is very her. And I think that what I did when I was working with technology companies is I'm often, like everything I'm doing is like, how can we stop competing for people's attention and monetizing it? How can we not monetize their attention? How can we not monetize their identities? And how can we create this sort of like, this experience that is much like what I try to do with my art, which is like, showing people showing people how literate they are in visual things, and empowering them for that understanding of, oh, I recognize something when it's fake. I recognize the intentions of the maker. I recognize when somebody's selling me something. And so if you remove all that, like the interface should never feel like it's selling you something. It should never feel commercial. It should never feel that it's tricking you. All those sort of like, I believe in like intentions, and that with visual things in design and art and video and animation, the intentions are totally visible.
When you see the rise of Alexa after her, and even a product like Portal, which has a screen and which could put effects, could eventually even power something like what Doug Roble was showing, or even what Victor was showing. What do you think about the kind of foresight of her around? Some people call it ambient computing.
Yeah.
What do you think about? What have you thought? Because just like me, you've been seeing the rise of these assistants.
Yeah, I mean, we should never have our head down. Like the future, our head should never be down. The future, it should be, we should never have to reach out to the thing. The thing should be like not there, And I think that I think there's an ideal in her. Like there's like, I always think of these like joyous moments that he was having with his iOS. And I think that is like, we can look to art like a film to like tell us what a positive future is.
I'm just remembering how touching it is to see him holding, you may not remember, but he takes the character out for kind of a walk in the park, and there's his phone in the camera so that she can see too and enjoy. And he is so joyful.
Yeah, but I think like, I mean, there's like complicated stuff in the film, but you also, that he never feel like he's like trapped by it, And I think that because it's part of like a narrative, it's part of this like linear narrative that was a film that explains something very, very complicated. And I think that like technology doesn't really do that. Technology goes like, what does it look like? What does it sound like? But that sort of like, that artful thing that Spike created based on a single concept, like one of the concepts design-wise was that the future is nice, explains something super complicated. And I think that is really the importance of art, like projecting technology forward.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about ambient computing, which would incorporate a virtual assistant and that sense of the computer is invisible. And then on the other side, what we in VR and AR call spatial computing. It almost does feel that whilst the Valley was trying to push spatial computing as the future, in the background, ambient computing is the thing that consumers actually have been downloading or purchasing. And I feel like her was a good example of, is spatial computing nice? I mean, I'm not sure that anyone would describe me and my Rift as nice, even though, again, I did work on it for 5 years. I love it. It's so cool. But I'm not sure anyone would describe it as nice. But ambient computing and what you showed, I think, does show the niceness of technology that is possible. What have you thought of as you've seen in the last 5 years? I don't know if you're an iPhone user, but just you're probably a computer user in some sense. Just how those OSs have evolved, and also how they haven't, how they've kind of stayed in the same paradigm almost. How have you felt as a user?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel like with Steve Jobs gone, it's like, I saw the image of Jim Henson, like it was when the Muppets came on. And you talk about virtual beings, you think of like, we need Jim Henson, we need Steve Jobs, like who were like artists, who were visionary weirdos, who were creating something like, they were aiming for this very distant place in space, And I feel like very much like when you look at the iPhone, like there were so many ideals within the design of that. Like you could talk about just that rounded object without even turning it on, that it represented something very powerful, which was his ideology. And I think now there's sort of these diminishing returns because the ideology is sort of gone. It's like now it's like super monetized, but you never felt like the first iPhone, you didn't feel like, oh, this is gonna take my money. You felt like this is like this, like where you didn't know where it came from. And I think that sort of magical thing in the way that like Muppets is magical. Like it's like the Muppets definitely can make you cry.
Well, my dream almost seeing that Portal advertisement where the Muppets are talking to you and you're interacting is that plateauing or even decline of smartphone sales could be arrested and reversed, and that screens could have a renaissance instead of us just forgetting about them and moving on to VR and AR, which doesn't seem like it's happening. Which was the company or two companies that struck you the most today?
It was the woman with the Jess Burlap. Yeah, that's very much the world that I believe in. It's like that it's the very small things that it's like it's not going to take like super powerful computing. Like it'll be there, but it'll be invisible. Like we won't even think about the computing because the design, the artfulness, and the intention is going to be so arresting and so surprising, like in a way that I feel like design and art can do. I think it's that sort of like, it's like an understanding of like cognition of how things look.
I think that's a very profound insight that the character, which we've been thinking about a lot at Fable, that a single character could be represented in many ways, from line drawing through to photoreal, and that it's the same character, just as I'm still my Animoji and a photoreal version of myself, and I am still me when I'm just texting with someone. I think that Baudrillard is a great hero of ours, and a lot of people, Jean Baudrillard, who is a French philosopher, around this kind of mediation. And I think we have a chance now to kind of hijack is the wrong word, but like that when I see the line drawing, we can get people to have the emotion in a much more efficient way. So for the last 5 minutes for this fireside chat, I wanted to take some questions from the audience who, since I haven't told anyone that, there is no microphone available. So the further back you are, the more you're going to have to shout. But I'll repeat your question, assuming I can hear it. So some questions from the audience.
Should there be a visual representation to the OS or not? What's your thoughts on that?
So he asked, should there be a visual representation to the OS or not? What do you think, Geoff?
Yeah, I think that we are. I've spent a ton of time. There was meant to be slides playing of images that I've done.
Oh yeah, whatever happened to that? Can Sam
just imagine
in the booth try and get that working? I'm sorry, Geoff.
I'm more of a lecturer anyway. I think it should, and I think that Mark Fisher talks about like imagining the future, and I often go to that of like, well, and it looks like something, and I am like a believer in visuals. Like I'm like visual things, like graphic things are my religion, because I believe that they reveal in a way that because I interact with making thoughts into images. And so I see like my experience with that is like I can articulate things in images that I could never do in words or with motion or anything in a single image. So
human though, or non-human?
I think non-human. I think it'll be something like that's like the opposite of uncanny. It'll be like something that feels cliche that we've never seen before. That'll be like this object that's right next to us that we never knew was there. I think very much like technology in the past. Like it feels very familiar, but it's arresting because it speaks. And is useful.
We got the images work.
Oh, yeah.
That's a very important question, and actually Pete, my co-founder, is very disciplined about reminding us at Fable not to focus on the visual because it's just so tempting, but an incredible relationship. I mean, many of us have had relationships with people over text before we've met them, or over Messenger or whatever it is. We've gotten to know them, we've learned their vibe and their energy for months before we actually managed to make time for a coffee. Same with the voice, obviously, extremely evocative. And then to your question of human or non-human, I was very inspired by what the Wave showed, where it was like, well, we had humans like in the music concert, and then we tried just having a little ball of light. So I think it is open. I am personally less interested in non-human. I think that human is, it just carries with it so much emotional weight in a good way, dynamics and just things that we will project onto it and receive from it, that I prefer human, just speaking personally. What about another question? Wow, okay. You're gonna have to shout, I think.
Yeah. What inspired you to include Alan Watts, the philosopher, in the Her story? I knew him before he died, and you did a great job representing him in that movie.
Yeah, that was, Spike wrote the script, but I know that he, my understanding is like, yeah, I love Alan Watts, it's great you knew him, but I think that he's exactly someone who articulates these sort of very abstract ideas that are like, he makes understandable like these very ethereal, poetic ideas, and I think that is like why can't, like what our new OS looks like, why can't it be poetic? Like it should be poetic. It's like it shouldn't look like technology, like you don't like, yeah,
Totally. You'll also have to speak up.
Can you give an example of a design that you thought really doesn't work? Like, you're a designer, so I know that there has to be something that just irritates you when you see it.
She was asking, can you give an example of a design that you feel doesn't work?
I'm just such a positive guy, man. I think, I can tell you when I approach like making things, I know the stuff that I did that didn't work was the stuff that actually looked like art. So like if I felt like my expression was getting in the way. So when I started the project, I just started making stuff. I made stuff out of wood, like, because I didn't have, like, to make an OS, I'm like, well, I'm not going to use the tools of today to make the OS of the future. It was sort of like, oh, I have to make it out of, I made all these 3D things, and they were all like, they were like a positive version of Minority Report, And I think like a sort of quietness was like the final result, and something handwritten. And I think it's sort of like design that you can ignore is sort of great design. It's like a version of great design. And then it can be lionized like a subway map. But in reality, you just use the subway map very quickly.
So there's someone obsessed with asking a question. They've got an incredible question that often leads to the worst questions. But is there anyone with a great question they'd like to ask? Otherwise, we're going to go to a break. And we have 2 panels and then a wonderful cocktail hour. And they're very short panels. So thank you very much to Geoff.
Thank you.
Terrific.